If everyone could take their seats, please. All right, tonight is the regular meeting of the Board of Education, CUSD 201, Tuesday, August 27th, 2013. And roll call, please, Mrs. McMahon.
Mr. Armstrong?
Here.
Ms. Caparelli?
Here.
Mrs. Charlton?
Here.
Mrs. Hancock?
Here.
Mr. Johnson?
Here.
Mrs. Notbush?
Here.
Mr. Price?
Here.
If we could stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, please.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, before we get started with the meeting, I would like to just take a moment and welcome to our district a couple of new administrators, and we just had a lovely reception. I hope you had some cake. So I'd like to introduce our new staff. Miss Edith Rivera, she's our new Miller principal. So if you want to come on up so the community can see your happy face.
I'm Edith Rivera, the new principal over at Miller. I just want to thank you for the warm welcome. It's been a great start to the year. Kids are wonderful and the families are amazing, so thank you for the welcome.
Welcome, welcome. And then at the high school, Mr. Kevin Wick, our Weck, assistant principal and dean. Am I correct on that?
Good evening. I'm Kevin Weck, the new dean of students over at Westmont High School. I'd first like to thank you for having this lovely evening for us tonight, and also thank you for welcoming me to District 201. Looking forward to our continued success.
Great, thank you, thank you. And then Lindsay Petruzek, am I saying that correct? Student Services Coordinator. Am I right on that?
Yes. Teaching and Learning Coordinator, Lindsay
Okay.
Peterzak. It's nice to meet you all. Very excited about this school year. Not only the families and the students, but the staff and faculty in this district has been amazing since I started, so I'm really excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Well, welcome again to her. Please come to any and all board meetings, if you'd like. Okay, the first item on the agenda is approval of minutes. The chair will entertain a motion to approve the minutes of the July 16, 2013 regular meeting of the Board of Education as presented.
So moved.
Second.
Did we get that? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed?
I need to abstain.
Okay. Matt, you got that? Okay, motion passed. The chair will entertain a motion to approve the minutes of the closed session of the July 16, 2013 regular meeting of the Board of Education as presented.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
And,
I need to abstain.
okay, thank you. Motion passes. August 13, 2013. The chair will entertain a motion to approve the minutes of the August 13, 2013 regular meeting of the Board of Education as presented.
So moved. Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Abstain.
Abstain.
Okay. Motion carries. The chair will entertain a motion to approve the minutes of the closed session of the August 13, 2013 regular meeting of the Board of Education as presented.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Abstain.
Abstain.
Okay. Are there any public comments? Okay, consent agenda. Are there any? I have one quick question. Kevin, the special ed teacher assistants, are these all full-time?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
okay. Anybody else? Okay, the chair will entertain a motion to approve the consent agenda as presented. Number 1, personnel recommendations. Number 2, certification of hazardous crossings. 3, board authorization of vehicle. 4, approval of student tour. 5, resolution to abate working cash funds. 6, approval of August 2013 expenditure report. And 7, ratification of July 2013 regular payroll.
So moved.
Second.
And roll call, please, McMahon?
Mr. Armstrong?
Yes.
Ms. Caparelli?
Yes.
Mrs. Charlton?
Yes.
Mrs. Hancock?
Yes.
Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
Mrs. Notbush?
Yes.
Mr. Price?
Yes.
Okay, the next item on the agenda is a presentation of monthly financial statements.
Well, this is the presentation of the June 30th financial statements. And the district received just about $216,000 from the state during the month of June. State had vouchered another $319,000 of FY13 payments that had not been released yet. We did receive the first 2 installments of the 2012 tax levy in the amount of a little over $10.3 million, which was a 47.9% collection rate, and that's about 1.6% lower than the 49.5% received last year at this time. So it's just slightly lower than the last 3 years as well. In the education and tort funds, the state had vouchered $214,000 that wasn't released to the district. And in the O&M fund, revenues are comparable to the prior 2 years. To end the year, revenues, including transfers from the working cash fund, were higher than budgeted, and that's a result of reimbursement of expenditures that we incurred for some of our capital projects prior to the bond issue, and we were able to reimburse ourselves for those. So that's reflected in those overall balances. It doesn't show up in direct revenues, but it shows up in the transfers and ultimately in the fund balance. And then the transportation fund, again, revenues are fluctuating from year to year based on the timing of state payments. And revenues did exceed budget. The state vouchered $104,000 of FY13 payments that were not yet received. And then expenditures in the ed and tort funds, they're comparable to the prior year average, and again, we've come in lower than budget. This is a result of there's actually 3 big factors in that. One is we did not know what our salaries for our teachers, our WESPA group, and administrators were when we did the budget, because contracts weren't settled, and they weren't settled until well into the year. We didn't amend the budget to adjust for that. And then our insurance renewal came in significantly better than expected. So our premiums were lower there. We had some special ed students that had been in private placements that no longer were moved out of the district, and so some of those things, and a 1 room and board student as well. So those expenditures were quite a bit lower than anticipated. And then again, some of our supply budgets in that fund, building principals, did not spend all of the revenue. However, I don't think that's going to be the case this year. I think they've all got big plans for that money. But again, thoughtful expenditures and really monitoring things. We've done a lot to try and control expenses. We budget for worst case, what we expect to happen, and it's always nice when it comes in better than anticipated. In the O&M fund, again, expenditures are lower than the prior year. And again, we had budgeted some, and this life safety fund is also included in here. We had budgeted some projects that we thought maybe expenditures would come in before June 30th, and they did, and we'll actually be paying for some of our events in the FY14 year. And overall, the O&M fund was 84.8% spent. We were 94.5% spent to date last year. So even greater reduction than I had anticipated. And part of that, again, was the, we budget for overtime based on, having bad winters. We had another good winter, so our overtime costs were well below budget. And then we've also had really good history with our electricity and our natural gas this year as well. And the electricity was significantly below what we had budgeted, and rates for electricity have continued to fall. So, and then we had some contingency budgeted in that we didn't need. So overall, we came in really well. We also received some of the, that fund has the reimbursements, that's in the revenue piece. So, and then in the transportation fund, expenditures were a little bit lower than the prior year. Again, some of that with our special ed students not being in district had caused a decrease in our special ed transportation budget costs. So, and then when we do the final FY14 budget, I'll have a comparison to show of where 2013 wound up, and then in comparison to the budget. And one of the things we do when we look at, a 5-year plan, this will impact our 5-year plan. We'll go off of the actual, look at the actual, and then our budget, and roll from there. So we should start to see some changes in our 5-year plan as well. So, does anybody have any questions?
I have a couple of small questions. The tax revenue that was a little bit lower, do you think we will make that up on our next payments?
Yes, I think so. And again, they kind of, especially the first one, when I look at the history here, it, kind of goes in a cycle. It's somewhere between, like that 46.5% to just under 50%. It's usually like 49%, and it just, it's really about how quickly people pay if they pay them early or not. So,
with the insurance coming in much better, does that include our workman's comp, or is that a separate thing?
No, that wasn't our workman's comp. Okay. The workman's comp is in the tort fund.
Okay.
So.
Okay. Okay, that's it.
Okay.
I just would have to say thank you for looking at and watching these expenditures. It is, I like that philosophy of planning for a rainy day, and and then when it doesn't, we're better off.
And really, some of the, cuts that we've made, some of the, contractual agreements that we have, obviously when salaries and benefits are, 80% of your budget, that's where you're going to make the biggest impact, is by controlling those and, making sure that you're not overstaffed, and that you're, your expenditures are staying in line with your revenues. And when you look at the revenues, for the most part, other than some few unexpected things, they're pretty much spot on. So it's really, our revenues, there's not a lot of movement there, but the expenditures are where we can really make some strides by controlling those.
That's good. Okay. Did you have anything?
That's all.
Okay. The next item on the agenda, funding options for facilities, and we have Miss Liz Hennessy here, and if you could come on up to the podium, and if you would reintroduce yourself for those that might not remember when you were with us last time.
Also, do you want me to put my presentation on the TV?
Sure, yeah, that would be great.
Yes.
We can, we received it late this afternoon. We can post that on,
Okay.
as part of our board book, so that anybody who's not watching this evening will be able to take a look at it.
Do you want me to put
Yeah, why don't we?
Okay. Liz.
Oh, do you have it? Okay, great. My name is Elizabeth Hennessy, and I'm with William Blair.
Why don't you hold on a second, because why don't we get you over there where you're on the camera? And
Thank you.
thank you.
good.
Okay. Again, I'm Elizabeth Hennessy. I'm with William Blair and Company. We help school districts underwrite bonds and come up with financing plans. Tonight, I'm going to discuss some very preliminary capital planning financing options, focusing firstly on the $15 million for Manning School. I realize your full capital plan is bigger, but tonight I just focused on that in conjunction with your discussions with the village. Okay? And again, I want to say these are preliminary because there are several ways that you can issue bonds and make use of potential revenues from a tax increment financing district. The problem is you don't know exactly when you're going to receive those revenues. So I'm looking at 3 broad options for how you finance the payments when you're not sure when that TIF revenue is going to come in. Okay, so let's just get first into the market overview. You were so smart issuing your bonds last year because you hit the market at pretty much its all-time low. Interest rates have gone up significantly in the last 3 months. Since the end of June, our Fed chairman talked about reducing the quantitative easing as soon as this 4th quarter, assuming the economy continues to do well, and then discontinuing it altogether perhaps in the 1st quarter of 2014 if we continue to see economic growth. That really threw our bond market into a tailspin. The Treasury rate is up a full percentage point from where it was back in May and April. Muni bond rates have gone up more than that. Back in June when the announcement came, the rates on municipal bonds, the 10-year went up 0.6% in just 3 days. So we've had that happening. On top of that, we have a lot of bad news for municipal issuers. Specifically, the Detroit bankruptcy has put a shadow over our market. Our local city, Chicago, also has suffered a triple downgrade from Moody's Investor Service. So it's really kind of a pall right now over the market. So you're going to see rates here that are a bit higher than we've looked at in the past for those reasons. What this graph shows is the blue line is your AAA 20-year municipal market data with rates going up. You can see in the last part since June. And then the green line is the 10-year. And this, again, is for the AAA, which is the highest rated possible bond. And those bonds are made up of an index of bonds across the country, not just Illinois. Okay? The next slide is the yield curve, and this shows where we are now. The green line, you can see the short-term rates are still really low, but the longer-term rates are going up. Okay, so in terms of capital facility planning, the district has in front of it, I believe, a proposal from the village of Westmont to share with the district revenues from the Central Downtown Tax Increment Financing District. And Downtown Financing District, the purpose, of course, is to improve the economic vitality of your downtown Westmont. Central Downtown TIFs it usually takes some time for the revenues to come in and the development to happen, depending on what developers are working with, as opposed to a TIF that's a shopping center where you know you've got like a Target or a Walmart or something like that coming in. So the timeline is usually a little longer for downtown TIFs. The village has estimated its revenue from the TIF, and the project is planning over 23 years, and they're estimating it'll equal $120 million, and it's proposed giving 25% of the increment to the district because the Manning School is within the TIF, but up to a dollar amount of $15 million. So that's very nice. The problem is we don't know exactly when that $15 million is going to come to the district. Depends on how quickly the TIF develops. We have in our office a TIF expert who's worked with several villages on downtown
TIFs, and he pointed out that the LaGrange TIF, very successful TIF, but it really didn't get going until after 10 years. So that's why the comment is the kind of the timeline on these things are a little bit longer. They can be very successful, but you just can't plan on getting those revenues right away, okay? So if the district borrows for up to 15 million projects now, it can use the incremental TIF revenue to offset the debt service payments. The village has also offered 25% of the sales tax from TIF properties for operational uses, and that is very generous and good, but sales tax, you know, is going to take a while to get going, and it depends what types of businesses ultimately come into that downtown TIF. What I'm suggesting as a first option for this project is to issue alternate revenue bonds. Those can be amortized up to 40 years. Our other bonds under the statute must be amortized over 20 years. So what that allows you to do is amortize your debt up to the life of the TIF, which is 23 years. So you can get past that 20-year mark. An alternate revenue bond has two sources of revenue pledged to it. The first source is the operating funds, such as the O&M fund revenues and the TIF revenues. You could never pledge just the TIF revenues. Why? Because we don't know when they're going to come in. We have to pledge something that we know. You have an audit history that comes in every year, and so that's why we're suggesting coupling the TIF revenues with, for example, your O&M fund revenues. The other source of revenue on alternate bonds is an unlimited pledge of a bond and interest tax levy. Okay, so that goes on the books at the same time. And each year, as your O&M fund revenues and TIF revenues become available to pay debt service, you abate the debt service levy. So this type of bond involves annual abatements. Okay. The alternate bonds also require a petition period and a public hearing prior to issuance, but they do not require a referendum. So the assumption in this option, this alternate revenue bond option, is that you're going to have operating funds sufficient to cover the debt service payments on the bonds up until the TIF revenues start to come in, and then once the TIF revenues, your share is paid up, it's going to be back onto your operating funds. So that's something we want to think carefully about. Can we afford to pay out of our operating funds some of the debt service on this Manning School if we don't want to go to referendum? Okay. All right, so this first option has a bunch of columns of numbers on it, and starting on the left side, this is the estimated TIF revenue, TIF incremental revenue from the village's estimate. And this village estimate includes just a growth factor of 2.5%. It also includes the projects coming on, and you can see kind of when the revenues jump up. So I think they've got some projects coming on in 2018, 2020, and 2023, which makes that increment larger. Now, the next column is 25% of these TIF revenues up to the 15 million. So this is the proposal I believe they've offered, and this column of numbers shows, you know, very small revenues starting here in 14 and 15, and then as those projects start to come on, those payments get bigger, and then they end here in 2029. This first option for level debt service for alternate bonds is 15 million of alternate bond debt service, and it's level, like a mortgage. So it's about 1,186,000 a year, and we're going out, in this case, 23 years from 2013 here. The TIF revenues don't really start till 2014. That's why they go out 1 year longer. Now, I mentioned interest rates are higher. For this level debt service option, your all-in true interest cost based on today's rates is about 5.01%. Okay. So if we structure our debt this way, what it means, if you look at the surplus shortfall column, Wherever there's a negative, that's money that you need to come up with out of the O&M fund, through your tax levy, through moving general state aid around, through, all the different ways you have to get money into that O&M fund. And we say O&M fund because it's a capital project. So you can see it's kind of heavy in the first couple years before that TIF revenue starts to get underway. And it could be, if the TIF projects take longer, you could end up paying those additional amounts for a longer period of time. So it just depends how it does. But this scenario is here to help you think about, gosh, could I afford that out of my operating funds? And if the answer is yes, if you've got leases expiring or something you could make room, great. If no, then we should probably look at some different options, okay? So you can see in the cumulative balance, the total debt service for this option over 23 years for $15 million is about $26.8 million of principal and interest, right? If we get $15 million from the village and we're using about $780,000 of the bond proceeds to pay for interest, our net cost is $11,075,000. So again, it's great that the village is able to pledge $15 million towards this project, but when you issue debt and you need to do the projects up front, you've got to pay for it over time, and there is that interest component. So your net cost in this option is about $11 million over time. Option 2 is if we try to structure this $15 million alternate bonds with a uniform debt service schedule. And what I mean by that is we're trying to shape the bond payments similar to the original estimated TIF revenues. So we're trying to minimize the amount we're going to be out of pocket up front by paying interest only for the first 10, 12 years. And then we start to increase the principal as the TIF increment increases as well. Now, clearly this goes past when your $15 million is up. But if that $15 million doesn't come in that fast because a project doesn't develop that fast, you have that full 20 years, 23 years. So that's why we tried to shape this debt service schedule similar proportionally to the estimated TIF revenue cash flow. So in this case, the interest cost is higher because we're paying interest only in the first 12 years and putting the principal at the end. Your all-in true interest cost in this scenario is 5.45%, and your cumulative cost is $16.1 million versus the level debt service where it was about $11 million. Okay, so this helps you at the beginning because the payments aren't quite as high, about $500 to $800,000 more than the TIF increment. But then at the end of the schedule, you have to be aware if you get your money sooner, you're going to have higher costs out on that long end of the schedule. So then, let's think about another way to pay for bonds other than out of operating funds. You have your debt service extension base, and you could issue funding bonds as a backup plan. So let's say you started out with alternate bonds. You could afford $500,000 to $800,000 in the first 5-10 years. The increment starts coming in, and you are able to cover your debt service. But then at the end of the schedule, like option 2, you see the negatives at the end of the schedule. We have some big payments to make after we've collected our $15 million. In that case, you could look at your debt service extension base, which will come available in 2019. If you remember, we issued those life safety bonds last year, and those get paid off by 2019, so very quick amortization, but you really don't have much room to issue new bonds until 2019. So you could see how it's going and pay some of those initial payments out of your operating funds, and then, if you get into a situation where either there's a delay in the development or you're at the end of the schedule, you want to start paying off bonds early using your debt service extension base. That is a good option because we could make those alternate bonds callable in 8 years, and when that debt service extension base opens in 2019, you could start calling in the long ones and paying off the principal. And of course, when you pay off that principal with a call, the interest disappears. So it would be a way of using your debt base now to offset those payments on the alternate bonds. You could do that, but remember your debt base could also be used for other capital projects. So it's an alternative use of your debt base. One option I didn't show you, but I just been thinking about all these options some more and more, is if you went to issue funding bonds or to issue funding bonds right now to pay off, to issue $15 million, okay? What that would mean, you see, we don't have any room in our debt base till 2019. But what we could do is refund the bonds we just did last year and stretch them out. Now, the negative of that option is we just issued those bonds last year at such great low interest rates. I hate to do that. But if you were to issue the $15 million paid from your debt service extension base, and then the TIF revenues come in, when the TIF revenues come in, you could start calling in those bonds and paying them off from your debt service extension base with the TIF revenues. So, you know, it still would cost you money for refunding to make room in your debt base and for the $15 million principal, but then as the TIF increment came in, you could use those funds to call in bonds and open up some space again in your debt service extension base. It's just, again, we don't know when those revenues will come in. So I can run that option if you think that's something you'd like to look at, because that certainly could be done without referendum and without hitting the operating funds at all. But it would use your debt service extension base up. So if you had more life safety bonds or more projects to do, that would not really be available to you. Okay? The next set of options are referendum bonds. And the next, the calendar looks at referendum bonds. March 18th is our next general primary election. Then we go to November 4th. The February elections usually aren't really available, but then the next election would be April of 2015. So you kind of see the dates. So these options assume you go to referendum in March of 2014, which is maybe too soon to plan for a referendum, but I just thought I'd put those options out there so you could see what the cost would be. So these referendum bond structures look at the $15 million of referendum-approved bonds for March 18, 2014. We've got level debt service, where the payments are the same over the 20-year amortization schedule. We do a 20-year and a 15-year amortization schedule. So if we went for the $15 million, and we went to the voters and they approved it, the annual payments for 20 years would be about $1,263,000 for just the $15 million. And that would be about $247 for a $250,000 market value home. Now, when the TIF revenues start to come in, we could have an early call on these referendum bonds so that we could start paying those off, call them in and pay them off soon as the TIF revenues come in. So that would take down $15 million off your cost to $24,793,000. Again, it'd be great to have these on have the voters approve them, because we don't know when that money's coming in from the TIF. So we have to think carefully, how would we explain that to the voters? We're asking you for $15 million. You know, if we put the projects together, maybe there's a higher number like $24 million. We know $15 million's coming back to us from the TIF. And we're just, you know, the problem is we can't promise them a lesser tax rate without really knowing when those revenues are coming in. We can estimate it based on what the village has told us, but again, it depends on the success and the timing of the developments. So here is the 20-year. And the next schedule is for 15 years for the $15 million, and that's about $290,000 a year. So again, the same thing could be done here with a referendum bond. You wouldn't be out any operating funds, and you would be paying down the debt service as the TIF revenues come in. I think it's better to call in and pay off bonds as the TIF revenue comes in, but another alternative would be just to abate the debt service. Say, hey, we got $800,000 from the village this year, we're going to reduce your tax rate on the debt service for this year. And that might give a taxpayer more immediate relief, but it doesn't get rid of any of the interest cost of the debt. So do you see the two differences there? If you call in bonds, pay them off early, you get rid of the interest component. If you just do an abatement, you're just giving, you might be able to give some tax relief sooner, but it's just a tax rebate for that year. It doesn't remove any of the interest cost of the original financing. Okay. So this is a summary of the options for the $15 million for the level debt service, the impact on the home, and the interest rates we're seeing for a 20-year and 15-year level debt service. And I know I've kind of thrown a lot of things out there for you, but you know, I open it up to questions, and I hope I can come back with some more options as we kind of rule out certain things or opt in on certain things. Referendum, no referendum, those kind of things. Questions, comments?
I guess I would.
Oh, sorry, Mary. I was just going to say this is a lot to digest, right?
Yes, it is.
Right at the walking in the meeting. So,
Obviously, at least I'm thinking, obviously, the major risk if we don't go to a referendum would be that if the TIF district did not take off as proposed, then we're going to run into a lot more debt along the way.
Correct.
So Liz, if we don't go to referendum, we have a limited bonding capacity. Do we know what that total number is and where we are against that number right now?
Yeah, it's this slide here. If you look in the yellow part of this box, that's really where your limited bond debt service capacity is. So, you know, we've used a good amount of it up with those life safety bonds just through 2019, though, very short. So certainly, if the TIF revenues didn't start coming in years 8, 9, or 10, or if the project's just not going well or being delayed, we could go ahead and issue funding bonds or refunding bonds as a backup plan to paying the debt service as opposed to paying it from the operating funds if we didn't go to referendum. Alternatively, we could issue $15 million using that yellow space now. We do that, we have to do another thing that can be somewhat costly, which is refunding those bonds we just issued in 2012.
What's the percent difference right now in the bond rates from?
Well, for the longer term bond rates, we're looking in, you know, the 20 years is like 480. And this bond issue, I think, was just around 2% or less.
Can't remember, but it
Pretty
was
It was
significant
really
difference.
really low. So it would be costly because we'd have to move, to do it now, we'd have to move some of this debt service out, but it can be done. And I'd be happy to bring back that option for you to think about.
So, following up on like the question that Gary had, and again, this is kind of a lot to bite on right now. So, let's just say we get to the point where the money isn't coming in, and we've kind of planned on it coming in. So then where are we? We have
Well,
to.
you have to, I think going into this, you have to be very conservative, okay? And you've got great estimates from your village. I'm sure they've got a great plan together, and let's hope it all turns out. But you know how the economy is. You know, we had that terrible thing happen in 2008 that, you know, with the mortgage backs and terrible Great Recession. Hopefully we're on the mend now, and the continuing improving economy will help this TIF take off. But I think you have to look at it, what happens if it doesn't? I think your question is right on. You have to say, gee, what's my backup source of revenue? Is it the operating funds, or is that too tight? Can we not afford $1 million, in the worst case, $1 million a year out of our operating funds, or $1.1 million? Okay? If the answer to that is no, then we should rule that option out. So then we look at this debt service extension base. If we do the $15 million now and use this debt service extension base up for another 15 years or so, plus the refunding, now we've got our $15 million, we can do our project, and we don't have to depend on any TIF revenue. But what we've done is we've used up our future bonding capacity, okay? So that's the disadvantage to that option. Now, if the TIF revenues come in, we can pay off some of those bonds and then free up some of that debt capacity once again. But the question is timing. You know, we can't plan exactly when those revenues are going to come in. So we just have to be flexible and know if we go for that option, we're going to give up some flexibility with future issuance on life safety and some of the things you use that for.
So looking at that, then that takes us out to 2036, right? Is that what you're
No,
what you're saying?
I don't think it would take you all the way out to 2036. This yellow box just represents the total capacity that you have right now. So I think it would be shorter than that, but I would say it probably would take you out between, 15 and 18 years on that debt base. So in terms of the risk ranking of these options, the first option, I think, when you're depending on your operating funds to pay the debt service if the TIF revenues don't come in, that's probably your riskiest option, because that, threatens if you have additional costs and whatnot in your operating budget. The second option, kind of in the middle, is this debt service extension base option. Using that, giving up some flexibility for future bond issuance, but at least getting that part done so you can fix your school in Manning, and then if and when those TIF revenues come in, pay it off. The option with the least risk is if you can go to the voters and you can approve the $15 million for Manning plus whatever other projects you have together for the voters, and then use the TIF revenue to pay off those referendum bonds. In that way, you have not lost any flexibility. Your debt base is still there for you next time you have life safety projects, okay? Your operating funds are not touched, and the voters are taking the burden of that referendum, which they would have to, of course, if they approved it and would want to. And then you're able to give them a tax break as that TIF money comes in. You'll be able to give them, pay down the interest, reduce their debt service costs from the $247 in this case to whatever the timing is of the receipt of those revenues.
So this, at the end where you're talking about the, on page 9, so this is what the option with $15 million referendum for 20 years.
Yep.
So if it's more.
If the referendum's more, we'll be happy to run
Obviously
those
affects
options.
that last
It'll
column.
go up in a proportionate basis in terms of the tax impact. But then we can show, different ways in which those TIF revenues would come in to help offset it. The thing is, we can't get our heart set and promise anyone that they're going to come in exactly that way. So I think these referendum options are your lowest risk options from the district's point of view.
Have you used this, I was going to say, have you had experience with this type of alternate revenue bonds where they were paid off by other funding source? I mean, we would use TIF money, right, to pay.
You're going to use TIF money, and you have to pledge your operating fund revenues, especially in the early years, because it's going to take a few years for that TIF increment to start producing funds. And yes, I have been involved in one other that worked out great. It's just hard to say. Every circumstance is different.
Right.
It was in Oak Park, and they did it, an alternate revenue bond for $10 million, pledging their TIF revenues, and prior to going to referendum. and then they went to referendum, got the referendum passed for their middle schools, and eventually called in and paid off those bonds with both TIF revenues and other revenues.
So if you use if I'm looking, for example, on page 10 here of the 15-year debt service, and then the proposed referendum debt service is a little over 21.5 million.
Okay.
So 15 million of that would actually be payment of that would be from the TIF.
Right. See, the
Right.
thing is, though, it's not dollar for dollar. When you issue your bonds by referendum, you have to pay interest on those bonds. The village is paying you 15 million over time, but they're not paying any interest component. They're just paying you 15 million straight. So when you look at, for example, the debt service on page 10, the total debt service is about 21.5 million, okay? So that's interest of about 6.5 million, right, on top of the 15 million. You're not getting that 6.5 million from the village. You're just getting the 15 million.
Right.
So, and it's coming over time as well.
Okay.
So,
But the increase in, I guess, impact for the taxpayers is 6 million.
they're going to pay 6 million over time, yes, more than the 15 million.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So Liz, one of the things that is not really here, and it may not be for you, Kevin, it may be for somebody else, but there, I'm sure, is information about best practices on funding for school districts and how much of their non-referendum capacity they should, is wise or judicious to utilize, that type of information, and that's not here, but we probably, considering the numbers we're looking at and the fact that we would be, we're getting closer to using more and more of our non-ref capacity, it might be good for us to have some information, whether it's from Liz or from another source, best practices, averages, what's worked, what's not worked, what people what sort of financial experts recommend, because I don't feel like we know that really.
I think we talked about it a little bit
once
about
before.
Last time we were considering the bonds for the life safety.
Which we had much less then, and we were talking about a smaller dollar amount too. So I feel like we're in a pretty different place now. We also didn't potentially have TIF revenue then, right. So it was a very different discussion. I felt like last time we had a lot more capacity available, and it was a much smaller dollar amount, and sort of a different world. Bond prices were really low. A lot of things have changed, and I would feel more comfortable if we just could get a little refresher on.
Well, I can tell you certainly the best practices for issuing limited bonds is to issue them in a short term, make sure that when you expect your next capital project to come along, within a range, you're going to have some capacity. And it just depends on the size of your debt base. If you look across Illinois, you'll see districts that will issue bonds for big projects and use it up all at once, but very consciously so, because they know they're locking themselves out of future flexibility for a good 15 to 20 years. The best practice is to pay those off short. Your project happened to be $5 million, and paying them off in 7 years, I think, is relatively short. So I think you really did a nice job and gave yourself future flexibility. If we decide to go ahead and use part of this for the referendum project, and then hopefully get some more capability when the TIF revenues come in, you just have to be conscious that that's going to use that up for a while. And so.
When you say use that up for a while, you mean just the $5 million that we took out?
If you decide to use the debt base to issue the $15 million, that will use up a good amount of this yellow space here on the page. So then, you will get some recaptures that TIF revenue comes in, but in the meantime, that's not going to be available to you.
And at a much higher rate, correct?
It's going to be at a higher rate for sure, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it's not available to us if there's emergencies or some other
Correct.
thing that comes up that we're not planning and not budgeting and don't know it's around the corner. I mean, that's really what part of that capacity is typically saved off for by districts and whoever has this. I mean, is for the things you can't plan for, right? I mean, isn't that sort of the purpose of this? Or
It's
one
for
way it's
that
utilized?
as well as for planned capital projects. You know, I know you guys have a very good capital plan where you've looked at your roofs and your different facility needs, when those things expire, your boilers, and when those will need to be replaced. That, I think, is another very common purpose for the debt service extension base.
I think the other thing we have to keep in mind under this specific scenario with the TIF money going only towards Manning is that we have our other buildings that are going to have needs, and we're probably going to need that capacity. If we have a chunk that that we're fortunate enough to be able to spend at Manning, we are going to have to use other capacity, including what would have gone to Manning during that time period at our other buildings to even out the capital projects throughout the district. So we have to really keep that in mind as we, think about how to move forward on something like this, is that we certainly have other needs elsewhere.
Well, that's why I asked the question about the referendum, because we're looking at projects that cost more than $15 million. So obviously
we'll
you
run more
extend it.
scenarios for that. But this gives you an idea, if you only did that 15 million, what it's gonna look like. So if we have projects that are 30 million, it's about double. So it gives you some point of reference and a kind of just a baseline to then move off of from there, the proportion to see what you wanna do. If you're just going to focus on that you're gonna get TIF revenues back in, this is what this might look like, but we wanna expand our scope. We'll run other scenarios, and then obviously the impact is gonna be greater, the cost to the taxpayer is gonna be greater, et cetera. But this gives you kind of a baseline to move off of.
Well, I can certainly appreciate the comment that you made about being conservative, because, we can talk about our money, such as it is, our school, but when we're talking about revenues from a source that we really don't have control of, I would absolutely veer towards conservative in that regard, because we have no control over how that is happening. So, on paper, it looks like one thing. So, again, I agree with what Joel's saying, is we have a couple things to think about. We have this TIF promise, but we also have other buildings that are, that are in the plan right now, so.
Liz, I seem to remember, and I wish I would have pulled the presentation from last time, but there was some information there on what is paid to, and I'm going to get the term right, so I'm going to look it up. What is paid to the person who serves as our underwriter, which would be your organization. I think last time we had some information about if we did this option or that option or this option, there were percentages about sort of what the actual cost is, not in interest and over the years, but the cost of the underwriting and all that kind of thing. I think that was in the last one, and I think I don't see it here, so
I think, when we get ready for a specific option, I'll break out all those costs of issuance for you. But just so you know, in our rate that I show on these things, called the all-in true interest cost, in that rate, we are also estimating our underwriting fee, all your bond counsel fee, disclosure.
I think that was more explicit last time, and I thought maybe you had it here, but
yeah, it's all wrapped up into
easily.
that rate.
Okay.
So,
So Liz, can I throw out a scenario, just to make sure I'm clear on this? So if we went, let's just say with the option one, the 15 million over 20 years.
Okay.
Our current bonds are paid down in 2019, correct?
Your current bonds, right, that are paid from the debt service extension base, yes.
So let's just say we vote yay on the referendum, and the taxpayers are looking at $247, roughly, let's just say, based on this scenario, $247 a year. and we start to get revenue from the TIF fund in 2020, at that point, we can start giving it back to the community, is that right?
That's right.
We won't be paying anything down because we've paid the current bonds off, right?
Well, the current bonds that expire in 2019, those would be paid, and that would be, if you didn't issue any more limited bonds for life safety or anything, then you would have a reduction in your tax rate in that year. It looks like it's about 18 cents, okay? So you'd have that reduction. Now, as the TIF revenues come in, you could use those TIF revenues to immediately abate the debt service payments, the 1.268 here.
Right.
So you could give immediate relief to the taxpayers as soon as those TIF revenues come in. Alternatively, let's say you get $1 million in 2020 from the TIF, you could say, I want to call in my longest bond, which is in 2023. I'm going to pay off $1 million of that. Now, that doesn't give your people in 2020 much relief, but what it does for you is it gets rid of all the interest you would have otherwise paid from 2021 out to 2032.
Right, okay.
So that's going to be the option that gives you the bigger bang for your buck. So, you know, we need to kind of think about those things up front. Not that you can promise now what a future board in 2020 is going to do, but just kind of know the difference in those options.
Thank you.
So in terms of kind of going back and coming back with maybe some more things to think about, would it be fair to say that you'd like to look more at the referendum options as opposed to the limited tax bond options or the operating fund options? Or should we do the limited bond option for 15 million or just focus on referendum? Just want to get some direction.
Are we ready to make that call right now?
No, well,
Can I say, can I just say I mean, I am not at all comfortable committing operating funds. I'm not at all comfortable with that.
we're not voting on anything tonight.
No, I know.
Say,
As far as the discussion goes, you
Right.
know,
I think
Absolutely.
the question from Liz is, you know, this is focusing on, you know, the TIF, potential revenue stream that the TIF could provide. And I think what Liz is, the question, you know, Liz is aware, because if you remember, she put together a scenario for, you know, we were looking at that time at $24 million when you look at the high school, Manning, Miller, and the junior high. And so this is kind of focusing on one portion of that. And so I think what Liz is looking for is a little direction as to, as she starts to build these models and include these other projects, is there an interest in Liz continuing to look at some of the options that are here in terms of using the debt limit, or should she just be focusing on referendum scenarios to get it all done?
Okay, yeah, and that's, I would like to see, since what's in front of us is this, as Kevin's saying, this $24 million ticket, so to speak, that we have been talking with from our facilities committee. So for me, I would like to see how that umbrella looks, because of the fact that, like, some of the questions, you know, that we've been asking, like, well, how does that look in that final column to the taxpayer? And what options, I mean, this, to me, this, from what we've seen before, to me, this kind of shows, well, you know, like what you said, it's least detrimental to the district to not use the O&M funds. However, you have to get that yes vote from your community.
Right.
So to me, I think this helps to get the big picture of all of it, because then you can, I guess, make that argument. Like, if we go for bonds, then we're tied in for this many years. But if we go to the community for the referendum, then, so to me, I would like to see both options, because this is good when you're talking about the TIF, income. But again, that conservative approach, how do we, how do we
Safeguard the district for future and that kind
Right.
of thing, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And so I think really, the purpose tonight was to look at all the different options and then kind of look at the pros and cons of each. And while they weren't really outlined, obviously, it's the degree of conservativeness that is in there and what level of risk the board is willing to take in being able to fund projects. And so I think that's really where we need to start focusing. Obviously, the more conservative, most conservative approach also deals with the R word, referendum. So, you have to look at that. The other, options, you don't have to, referendum, but they're also considerably more risky. And, given uncertain economic times still and things like that, the board needs to really gauge its level, its appetite for risk.
So I think that given Joel's statement about the fact that we do have more projects than just what your initial pass represents, I think it would be beneficial for us to see maybe 24 million, is that kind of the number? See what 24 million looks like on one of your green and yellow and red and black and scary charts. I think that I would be very interested to see from a referendum perspective what that dollar amount looks like, because if we're going to go through a process, whether it's getting money that is in our current debt service capacity or whether it's going for referendum, either way, we do know that we need a little bit more than sort of where you started with our examples. And it would be helpful to see if we were truly going for what we needed to do our security projects and do all of the facilities things that we need. I would really like to see what that sort of bottom line looks like.
Very good.
And I ditto the same thing. And so for me to understand it, because at some point we really have to understand it and figure out what our risk factor is, it makes that argument as to why you would go for a referendum, just because of how much it ties up the district for the next 20 years or whatever. And again, when we're talking about these safety issues at the schools, it's our job to kind of figure out how we're going to do this. So it does help me to see both options. What is the bonding capacity? And then there's the referendum question. So,
Okay.
yeah,
Good.
I would say both options at this point would probably be the best for us to review before we move forward. And then just one other question. Does anyone ever go out 40 years?
Well, on referendum bonds, you can only go out 20 years.
Okay.
On the alternate bonds, you can go out 40 years. But no, people generally don't go out 40 years. 25 years, though, is something we've seen, and we see districts going to get special legislation to go out 25 years, just because the improvements, especially when you look at a referendum, they often last a lot longer than 20 years. So I think there is justification for that.
Okay.
These alternate bonds right now, given our current position, the alternate bonds, these two scenarios are really our only scenarios other than the referendum, right?
Well, you do also have the limited bond scenario, but I don't think you could get 24 million out of your limited bonds. You
Right.
probably could get 15 million out of there. But again, that's going to use up that future capacity.
So I guess the upshot of these two, and I do agree, it's probably important to see what the numbers actually shake out with, but, on one hand, we're looking at killing our bond capacity with a higher interest rate, or, I'm sorry, that first option, what was the downside to that first? Oh,
Paying out of operating funds.
no, promising our O&M funds to
Yes.
cover any TIF money. So if the TIF money never comes,
It's all operating funds.
it's all operating. So I guess we just have to gauge, do we want to make that commitment, or do we want to commit to going for a referendum? And I do agree, it's probably a good idea to see all the numbers, but in my mind, that's sort of the bottom line that we're looking at here. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, Mary Kay, I think what Kim said, it's about the risk, right?
Right.
Like those first
Right.
options are really high risk.
High
and-
risk.
Would you ever go
referendum's
for
risk.
multiple options, like use one of these options for the 15 million for the TIF and then another option for the remainder of the, I mean, I don't know if I really like that.
Well, if you're
But-
going to go to referendum and go
You would
through all the
put it all
work,
together.
it's really go big or go home type of thing, and do it, because it's the same amount of work whether it's 5 million or 75 million. I mean, it just, so again, I think you can look at these options too, and if you're looking, and we'll just go, you know, maybe I'm being too simplistic, but if you look at page 4 and you looked at that option, okay, this is at 15 million. If you did 30 million, you're almost at probably double then. So instead of almost 1.2 million shortfall, you're gonna be, 2.4 shortfall. So it's really based on a $25 million budget, where are you going to get an extra $2.4 million to do those things? And so to kind of keep that in mind.
Well, and that, I guess, goes right to the point of seeing all the numbers, because then I think it helps me understand to speak with intelligence when we make the decision as to what we're going to do. If the community has asked for these projects for a long time, so therefore, we have two options. We either deal with our debt for a long time, or we go to the community. And like you said, the projects that you tend to go for do last quite a long time. But you still have to have some money somewhere for that rainy day, or, such things, so. So did you get your question answered from us?
Thank you very much. Appreciate your feedback and appreciate your patience in looking at all these options. And
Thank you, Liz.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
for having me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Right. Well, Kim and I will have a conversation with Liz, and then we'll invite her back to another meeting.
Good. Thank you very much. Good for a second. Okay, the next item on the agenda is superintendent's report.
Included in my report first with regards to facility update. And again, the Early Childhood Center at South, it's basically completed. There are a couple of minor things, and we're waiting on signage for both the district office side and then also for the early childhood side, and we'll include South in that lettering. But I do want to thank Mike Mayoros and his guys who did a great job in a short period of time in getting everything moved into that space, and the staff of our early childhood center, they did an excellent job getting those classrooms ready for students. And just in general, our buildings were in great shape as we opened the year. And again, that's a tribute to Mike and his hard work and his group of guys. In terms of the school opening, the opening of school went very smoothly, without a hitch. A lot of smiling faces. I know it's early, but both students and staff, and really just being in the classrooms and seeing just a lot of what we've been doing in terms of staff development with differentiation and student-centered learning. You're seeing a lot of that taking place in our classrooms, and it's exciting to see. The other thing that I did today as well, because of the heat, I made it a point to make it to Manning and Miller to make sure that the learning environment was sufficient for our students. And, when we put those units in our classrooms, it's really paying off dividends now. And even though the hallways are not air conditioned, just the fact that the building and the classrooms does help with the hallways even. So I checked with students and staff, and everybody said yes, they're comfortable, they're happy. A lot of thank yous, so that's very nice to see.
You watch the news, the last couple days in the districts where they don't have air conditioning in their ancient buildings. It's quite a relief to not.
On the way here, I just heard about how many schools had to close early, so I am sure that the staff and the students really are happy about that.
Very appreciative of that.
And we got that money for a low rate, so that's great.
Yeah, there you go. Also included in the report, updated staff plan. Now, it does not reflect the hirings that took place today. So again, we'll tweak that a little bit. And I did get a question about, there's some space holders for the early childhood. And we did hire an additional, formally hire an aide today. And yes, the early childhood center is still, we'll be looking at personnel. And then also in conversations with our Director of Special Services, Linda Clowwitter, just looking at student IEPs and student needs in our other buildings, we may be looking at teacher assistants in those facilities as well. And then we did this last year, I included a board calendar for you to kind of let you know some things that we do are cyclical. And so to kind of let you know, for instance, next month we'll do the formal approval of the budget for the new fiscal year. So all those things are part of the calendar so that as we're planning agendas and looking at board meetings, you can kind of anticipate a little bit of what to expect with each of the upcoming board meetings.
So just, I'm
sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I'm wondering at some point after the school year really gets underway here, will we get maybe some feedback, particularly from Miller, on the dual language kindergarten and also on the 2 grade levels where we doubled their class sizes, just to understand sort of those are fairly significant changes, how things are progressing with those things. And then from both the elementary buildings related to the full day kindergarten, just kind of get our final, this is what actually, where we actually ended up as far as full day and some people who selected half day and how those things, definitely would like, I don't know, a month in maybe or so to get some feedback on those items.
Definitely.
That's actually kind of where I was going to go, just because we've got some new things, the dual language, and also in addition
Schedule at the junior high.
Absolutely, that might take a little bit longer. We'll see. But yeah, that's such a huge change.
They figure out where they're
going. It might take half a year to really.
Yeah. But definitely, we'll invite the administrators to give an update to the board on how those changes have impacted their buildings.
And the new, the new programs and such.
Right. And we are planning also, once kind of the dust settles again, to have some type of an open house at South, because we never formally had an open house for the administrative side, and now with the early childhood side completed, have some type of open house so that people can see the facility.
Perfect. That was the other thing I was going to
Yep, sure.
Okay. So, done with that. Are there any board reports?
I have just one. Just want to wish our board president a happy birthday today. Thanks for coming out tonight. We appreciate it.
Thank you. I don't think I had a choice, but, thank you, Gary. I just would like to say, thank you to all the administrators and the teachers for really getting ready for another school year. I'm sure that Linda, the staff at the early childhood and that whole area is going to be happy that with a summer that they don't have to redo everything. So I know that probably had to take quite a bit of work to get that done. And even to get the junior high ready with, for the changes that, from what I'm hearing so far, that seems to be going well. And so seems.
And then our first high school football games Friday night, home game.
Yes, it is.
Is it, so it's JV and then varsity, I don't have the times right in front of me, but I'm sure it's on the website, right? So we definitely,
5 and 7.
a lot of people are really excited about high school football starting, so, people, community can come out and support the high school, obviously, it would be great for our players.
And the marching band.
And the marching band. Support our whole high school. Buy food from the boosters, cheer for the marching band, and be raucous for the football teams.
Okay, any other board reports? Okay. Are there any public comments?
Just really, Dan Charleston, and just a couple quick comments. I wanted to say out loud, first off, I think so highly of Liz Hennessy. She is dominant in her space. She's a fantastic underwriter, and Blair is a fantastic underwriting firm. But she is an underwriter, and so I'll encourage the district to consider a municipal advisor as you guys go through the process of looking at options. Someone who isn't paid for actual issuance of the bonds. So the other thing is, with respect to the budget for last year, congratulations. The numbers were fantastic, and just looking at the fund balance summary, you know, that was nearly a $2 million surplus last year. That's fantastic news. And over the last 3 years, nearly $6 million in additional operating funds. Fantastic news. We're obviously deploying some of that and able to give staff raises both at the teacher and administrative levels, some large. We're deploying them in the buildings. The one space that I'll pile on a little bit to Shannon's comment, the one building where academic performance has truly deteriorated the last 2 years is the one building where we've taken away resources. So I hope you'll very seriously look at that, consider that, and consider the teaching situation there. Thank you very much for your guys' service.
Okay, are there any other public comments? All right, then the chair will entertain a motion to enter close for the purpose of discussing collective bargaining and personnel issues.
So moved.
Second.
Roll call, please, Mrs. McMahon.
Ms. Caparelli?
Yes.
Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
Mrs. Hancock?
Yes.
Mrs. Charlton?
Yes.
Mrs. Bush?
Yes.
Mr. Price?
Yes.
Mr. Armstrong?
Yes.
And there may be a vote after closed. We are back in session. The chair will entertain a motion to approve the 2013-2014 administrative contracts as presented.
So moved.
Second.
Roll call, please.
Mr. Price?
Yes.
Mrs. Notbush?
Yes.
Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
Mrs. Hancock?
Yes.
Ms. Caparelli, yes. Mr. Armstrong?
Yes.
And Mrs. Charlton?
Yes. Okay, the next meeting of the Board of Education is September 10th, 2013, 7 o'clock. The chair will entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Meeting is adjourned.